So this is, yeah, we're all good. Okay. I'm going to talk about the revolution that we're all waiting for, that you've all heard about. The 90% of jobs in the future won't exist and all that sort of stuff. The revolution that's going to revolutionise everything, and some of the discussion around that. And I'm going to try and add a little bit of evidence to that discussion through my presentation. You will be able to access this presentation if you want on my blog afterwards, so there's quite a few references in there. So if you want to, I'll put this up on my blog and then you'll be able to click through to find any references that you're after. Okay, so, right. This is William Herd Kilpatrick in 1918. In 1918, William Herd Kilpatrick wrote an essay which became very popular and very influential, and the essay was called The Project Method. And I just realised I need to get my... Okay. This is one of the things that he wrote in the Project Method. I should have had that ready, shouldn't I? I should have had that ready. Okay, so this is William Herd Kilpatrick, 1918. Now, apart from the archaic and faintly sexist language, see if any of this sounds familiar. Suppose a girl has made a dress. If she did in hearty fashion, purpose to make the dress, if she planned it, if she made it herself, then I should say the instance is that of a typical project. We have in it a wholehearted, purposeful act carried on amid social surroundings. That the dressmaking was purposeful is clear. And the purpose once formed dominated each succeeding step in the process and gave unity to the whole. That the girl was wholehearted in the work was assured in the illustration. That the activity proceeded in a social environment is clear. Other girls, at least, are to see the dress. So that's William Herd Kilpatrick writing in 1918 about the project method. This is project-based learning. Influential article on project-based learning from 2012. I'll give you the chance to read that. So, apart from a change in language, in how we talk about it, it's exactly the same thing. Nothing's changed here. For over 100 years, this is what Herd Kilpatrick says, he didn't even invent the term, he reckons. I did not invent the term, nor did I start it on its educational career. So for over 100 years, project-based learning has been the recommended approach by various educational gurus. I'll pause. That's all right. So, there you go. 1918, 2012, nothing changes except the way that we talk about it. Yet for some reason, this is the future. This is what we need to do to prepare all those students for the jobs that don't exist yet. We need to do project-based learning. It's a revolution. It's revolutionary. It's what we need to do. It's new. Where's the evidence for project-based learning? It's been around for over 100 years. Where's the evidence? Where's the evidence to support the use of project-based learning? This is the Education Endowment Foundation. This is what they wrote about project-based learning when they reviewed it. So it's been around for over 100 years, heavily promoted all that time, and the evidence seems to be weak. The reason the Education Endowment Foundation reviewed the evidence on project-based learning is because they're about to run a study. So they ran their study, they conducted a trial, and they found potentially negative impact of project-based learning. However, this result was compromised by the fact that a lot of schools in the experimental condition dropped out. So it either doesn't work, or it's actually hard to do, or maybe it's a bit of both, or maybe it's something else, we just don't know. That's the current state of evidence for project-based learning. So it doesn't work in practice, and it doesn't seem to work in theory either. So we know, for instance, that novices, when they learn something new, they require a lot of explicit guidance. They require a lot of explicit instruction. They need to be guided through the new knowledge that they need to acquire. They need to have new skills demonstrated for them. The link there, if you go on my website later and have a look, the link there is to a very important paper by Kirshner, Sweller, Clark, where they explain why, from a cognitive perspective, novice learners need full guidance. Open-ended tasks are better suited to people that already have expertise. One thing that's very interesting, when people talk about project-based learning, they often talk about expeditionary schools in the US. And I've had a look at the expeditionary school stuff. It's curious, and I think I've got this right. They have 8-week units, and it's the final third where they do a project. Now that to me doesn't sound like it's project-based. It sounds to me like they're teaching them the content and the skills, which they're then applying in a project. Now if you were to do that, that makes a lot more sense from a cognitive science perspective, because you give them the necessary tools to then apply in the project. We also know, and John spoke about this morning, that students don't necessarily make good choices. So we can look at studies back in the 1980s. Richard Clark looked at the choices that students made, and the more expert students tended to choose direct instruction, and the less expert students tended to choose unstructured problem solving, which was actually the opposite of what they needed, because their choices led them in the wrong direction. And actually there's a wait a minute, where's that gone? Oh, I seem to be missing it, but there's another study that was done recently, which I was just looking at over the last few days, and they got students to read texts. So they put 3 texts online, and they got the students to read the texts, and they said, they gave them a test on comprehension of the texts. They said, which one do you think you understood least well? And they said, which one would you restudy? And then they put them in 3 options. So a third of the students got the text to restudy that they'd chosen to restudy. A third of the students got the text to restudy that they'd rated their comprehension lowest of. So the one that they said, I didn't understand that as well. So they got that one to restudy. Actually, it was in terms of how many questions they would get right about it. They had to predict how many questions they get right. And a third were given the text selected by the computer on the basis of the one that they performed lowest in the test of comprehension. And actually, the students in that condition who had the text selected for them by the computer did better than the 2 groups of students who got the same result, essentially, the ones where they chose what to restudy, and the ones where they restudied the one that they'd rated that they had the lowest comprehension on. So this actually provides quite important evidence around student choices, yeah?
I'd just like to know what that study was.
I thought I had, it should be on my PowerPoint. It is missing. It's, there's a link on this. I seem to have an older version of the PowerPoint, but I did have a slide on it, but I don't know what's happened to it. So apologies for that. So why are people keen on the idea of project-based learning? Why is this always going to be the revolution that's going to change everything, that's going to solve everything, that's going to prepare kids for the future? It was preparing kids for the future back in 1918, if you read the rhetoric about it. That's exactly what it was going to do then, and that's exactly what people are proposing now. So why do people commit to project-based learning? Why is it such a fashionable idea? Well, if you ask people, they'll talk about things like innovation and entrepreneurialism and things like that. They'll talk about 21st century skills. So they'll say, well, by doing projects, kids will learn to collaborate, they'll learn to be creative and things like that. They'll talk about motivation. They'll suggest that project-based learning is motivating for students, that it's more motivating than dreadful old traditional forms of instruction. They'll talk about things like deep learning. And what a lot of these claims have in common is that they're very difficult to assess. So whenever you put up a test and you say, okay, here's a test of what the students have learnt, they'll say, oh yes, but it doesn't show up on, the effects of project-based learning don't show up on those sorts of tests. Because what it enables students is to sort of learn at a deeper level, or that they're developing creativity or something. Then if you even say maybe design an assessment of transfer, so the ability to transfer their understanding to a new context, then people will say, oh yes, but there's something else. There's something else that isn't captured in your assessments. So it's actually quite difficult to argue against, because people sort of want to believe in things like project-based learning, but they don't feel the need to have an evidence base, or rather it's the reverse of that. Any evidence that you present about project-based learning can be dismissed because it's not measuring the right thing. And this idea that it is inherently more motivating, I find that quite difficult to accept. There's a guy, David Perkins, in the US. He wrote a book, 2014, Future Wise, all about the future. It's about the future. It's about the future. And he suggested things like a project where students plan for their town's future water needs or model its traffic flow. Now, I'm not sure that that's hugely motivating for kids. I don't see why those sorts of projects, typically they're supposed to be real-world, realistic projects. I'm not convinced that these are necessarily more motivating for students. Students like to spend a lot of time actually in make-believe worlds. They read fantasy books, they read Harry Potter and things like that. Why is it so motivating to model the traffic flow in the local town? I don't quite follow that argument. And one of the things that we do know about motivation is that motivation is actually linked to getting better at something. So there was an interesting study in Canada a couple of years ago, and they tracked students through early grades of maths, and they found that they assessed their levels of motivation, intrinsic motivation for studying maths, and they assessed their achievement in maths. And they found that intrinsic motivation didn't predict later achievement. However, they did find that achievement predicted later intrinsic motivation. So in other words, by getting better at the maths, they were getting more motivated about maths. Now if that's the case, the goal of students and the goal of instructing them effectively don't conflict with each other. They're both, you want to select the same strategies, because the same strategy will do both. On the deeper learning, I couldn't resist this opportunity. I have a little spoof blog site called Making Learners Extraordinary, and this is one of the graphics from my spoof blog site, and it's about it's a thinkiness scale, and this is my depth of thinkiness. So you've got shallow thinkiness at the top, which of course we all know is what we call a regurgitated indigestible facts, and really deep thinkiness at the bottom, which is interpreted answers. That's the thinking stuff, yes?
Did you see David Diddell's thing a week or so ago where he took the heavy roller to the idea of depth?
David Diddell? No, I didn't actually, but you do see a lot of deep stuff. I noticed on John's slides this morning it had deep motivation has
an basically put the heavy roller over the whole idea. I can send you a link to the article later.
Great. Oh, and this is the other one, okay? So if you go around saying, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence for this thing that you're asking us to do, people will call you a positivist. And I didn't understand this at first, but when I looked into it, apparently positivists accept no a priori assumptions, and it's all about data collection and interpretation. And I don't even think I am a positivist, because I accept a number of a priori assumptions about things that are right and things that are wrong and stuff like that. But apparently the quest for evidence in education is positivism, and therefore any argument mounted on the basis of evidence or a lack of evidence is a positivist argument, and that's the end of that, really. And there you go. But I'm not sure that that's very convincing, because I still want to see evidence for the things that I'm being asked to do. I think this is useful. So we've got project-based learning. Project-based learning has been around for over 100 years. We haven't got much evidence that it works. Lots of people are in favour of it. Lots of people are promoting it. Why? Well, when you talk to them, what you get is a rationalisation. So people will work backwards very, very intricately, very, very carefully, explaining why the evidence or the lack of evidence can be dismissed and why this thing is useful. However, I think that it's not just a fashionable idea that people are committed to. You do get this effect where once people are committed to an idea, they stake their reputation on it, they're associated with that idea, they introduce project-based learning, say, into a school. You're very unlikely to convince them that it's not an effective approach, because they've got so much invested in it. And that is a really important effect in a lot of these ideas, which is one of the reasons we need to get the evidence out there. People need to be aware of the research evidence before they opt into these sorts of programs, so at least they know what they're getting themselves into. However, I think that there are much deeper roots to things like project-based learning. And that's why it persists. So, for instance, it's not a coincidence that William Herd Kilpatrick, back in 1918, was writing about project-based learning. William Herd Kilpatrick was a student of John Dewey and was a major populariser of John Dewey's work. He was a leader of the Progressive Education Association in the US in the early part of the 20th century. And I think the two things are inextricably linked. One of the defining features of what we might call the progressive education movement, of which William Herd Kilpatrick was a part, is this idea about natural forms of learning, that learning should be natural. This is Kieran Egan on this topic. Kieran Egan wrote a very good book, Getting It Wrong from the Beginning. It's worth having a look at if you get the chance. This is Egan. Once methods and curricula more hospitable to children's natural modes of learning were in place, their desire for knowledge would be released. The progressive movement in particular have been convinced of this idea. And in the 20th century, immense amounts of time, energy, ingenuity and money were expended on trying to make the learning in schools match children's spontaneous learning in household, street and field. This is G. Stanley Hall in 1901, one of the early leaders of the progressive education movement. The guardians of the young should strive first of all to keep out of nature's way and to prevent harm. These ideas can be traced back at least as far as Rousseau and his philosophy, romantic philosophy, and his ideas on the child in his book Emile outlines this idea that learning should be natural. It should be a natural process. Activity schools. Activity schools were a 1930s model of school, broadly based within the umbrella of progressive education. This is James M. Lynch in 1935 trying to define an activity school. 1936, sorry. The school becomes a place where children carry on, explore, converse, play games, build boats, kites, electric bells, aeroplane models, draw, paint, and form groups in order to produce a play, as they would in a world of their own. The function of the teacher is to guide children to do better those things in which they engage naturally. Reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and history are learned just as talking is learned, as means to the realisation of desired ends. So that makes explicit this desire to make school learning more natural, more like the sorts of things that children will spontaneously engage in themselves. And that is the idea that sits behind when you strip away the rationalisations and people just committing to things and not wanting to back down, what sits behind all of that and what drives things like project-based learning is this idea that learning must be more natural, must be more spontaneous, it must be more authentic, it must look more like what people do in the real world. This is Brian Camborne, educator interested in whole language. This is what he said. I'll give you a chance to read that. So again, it's making this, it's posing a question, but why is it that school learning is different? Why can't we just spontaneously learn the things that we need to learn in school in the same way that we learn to walk and talk and all those other things that we do outside of school? Camborne also proposed a theory of natural assessment for whole language programs, and it's based upon the way that parents naturally talk to their to their children. So this idea of learning being natural, even assessment being natural, nature, it sits at the heart of this. But it's a problem, and it is really confusing. When you think about it, why is it that something like learning to read or learning basic mathematics is so effortful? It does seem to be, is it schools that are making it complicated? Is it schools that are making it difficult? Is it because they're built on this factory model that Ken Robinson tells us about, and it's just unnatural, and that's why students can't learn that way? And perhaps we should have a revolution and change the way schools are, or just, and then make them more natural, and then kids can learn through projects, and they'll all learn to read and write and do those things as easily as they learn to do stuff in their private lives. It is a bit of a conundrum. Why? We don't seem to be able to do that. Well, here's my attempt to try and explain this. This is the human existence clock. So what I've done, anatomically, modern humans arose about 200,000 years ago. We don't know exactly when they started speaking, because we've got their bones, but we haven't got what they said, so we don't know. But they looked like us about 200,000 years ago. And if we make that midnight, okay, and now midnight the following night, the first farmers arrived about 10:34 p.m. Sumerian writing appears at about 11:24 p.m. So that's the earliest writing. I think that's the earliest writing we've got. And then mass literacy, which occurs in Europe around the middle of the 19th century, starts to occur then. That arrives at about 1 minute to midnight. There's some Sumerian writing for you. So what's that got to do with anything? Well, there's an educational psychologist called David Geary. And Geary's got a theory of biologically primary and biologically secondary information or knowledge. He believes that over time we've evolved a sort of mental module for learning to speak. We can't just be born speaking, because we've all got these different languages and stuff, but we've learned we've evolved a module that enables us to learn to speak and pick up our native language and pick it up from our parents and things like that. And things like walking and stuff like that, they're all biologically primary. We've basically evolved to do them. However, things like writing, we can't possibly have evolved to read and write, because there just hasn't been enough time for evolution to act on that. Because mass literacy has been around for such a short period of time. For most of history, most people haven't been reading and writing. So what we actually have to do is we have to co-opt some of the systems that we use for speaking, and we have to co-opt those and sort of re-engineer them to do things like reading and writing. And that's effortful. And that's why picking up reading and writing is not the same as picking up talking. It requires a different approach. So to Geary, you've got biologically primary knowledge, and you've got biologically secondary knowledge, and they're inherently different. I've just realised I can answer that lady's question. Did she leave? Oh. That's the paper. I've got it in my head. How restudied decisions affect overall comprehension for 7th grade students by, I think it's TD, Redford, Wiley and Griffin. But it's linked. It'll be linked on the one that I'll put up on my blog site. So this is the explanation. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that there's no implication for this. It could be that project-based learning is the most effective way to learn biologically secondary information or knowledge or skills. It could be that. This is agnostic about that. But it does explain why there might be a difference. It does explain why learning to speak might be different and might feel different and might be experienced as different to learning to read and write. And it might be that this is why, when we look for the most effective ways of learning to read and write, that they don't look natural. They don't look like what kids would do left to their own devices. This might explain, for instance, why a whole language approach to learning to read, which is based on the idea of sort of immersion and kids picking up language through, wanting to read real books, isn't as effective as a deliberately planned and structured phonics approach. It might explain that, because it might explain why those things might be different. I think it draws out another intriguing possibility, and I'm just speculating here now, so I'm going a little bit off reservation, and this isn't anything I've got any evidence for. But teaching might be a biologically primary skill. I mean, presumably, for a very long time, people have been, yes?
You're spot on. There's been some really interesting work done in primary, actually, looking at a series of inbuilt behaviours of adults and children from the age of babies. And there are signals that adults send that children automatically pick up on, which is, I'm going to teach you something. So it is actually biologically primary. I will send you the citation if you give me your email.
Brilliant,
Otherwise
thank you.
we'll have to rely on the thought.
Thank you. No, that's great. So, there you go. So I just said it was all speculative, and it isn't.
No, it isn't. Not at all.
None at all. So, and then again, that has to then factor into how we think about instruction. We know how resistant, for instance, we're always reading about how resistant teachers are to changing their practice, and for hundreds of years people have been trying to get them to stop standing at the front of the room and telling people stuff, yet look what's happening now. It seems incredibly resistant to that, and that might be linked to this sort of long history of doing similar things. So, how are we going to have time? Might have time for a few questions. So let me summarise. 1918. I'll just go back. There you go. There he is. 1918, William Hone Kilpatrick, project-based learning. 2012, Learning Futures, project-based learning. No evidence. No evidence. Doesn't work in theory. So why are we so committed to it? Well, apart from the reasons why we do tend to be committed to the things that we have tried and implemented that we stake our reputation on, I believe that there is something fundamental about our conception of learning that sits underneath this. The idea that learning must be natural, that the way that we learn in school is deficient because it doesn't emulate the way that we do things out in the real world, and then it needs to look more like that. And that's a key idea that underpins this view. Thank you. So, we've got a little bit of time just for any questions, if anyone's got any questions or anything to add. No. John.
Greg, the concept of novice to expert is a key one that underpins this. Your sort of take on project-based learning, I think. So I wonder do you think there are times in kind of a learning sequence for kids when they have developed a set of expertise or a certain level of expertise when project-based learning might be appropriate, or do you think it's just kids kind of generally in school aren't expert enough at anything for project-based learning to be appropriate?
I don't think we've got evidence to suggest that definitely you should do projects at the end of a sequence of instruction. I don't think we've got much strong evidence to say you definitely should. However, theoretically, it would be a lot less not harmful, but it makes a lot more sense to go there. So one of the things that we have to try and work out is the novice expert continuum, and when we can release control more to the students from the teacher's explicit instruction, and that's quite complicated, and that's what we have to work out when we're designing sequences of instruction. If you have students who are sufficiently expert in an area, then they can do more open-ended tasks. Now that could be writing to an essay prompt, or it could be conducting a project. I can't say yes, that would definitely be a really effective thing to do, but it certainly makes a lot more sense than setting out with novices from the start doing project work. Yep.
You've obviously given project-based learning in that form a bit of a bagging, and that's music to my ears. But in terms of very general advice for schools, if there were one or two things you think are, rather than putting resources into something like this, what should schools be putting resources into?
Okay, so on Monday, for my talk at the ACE conference, I'm going to talk about explicit instruction. I'm going to talk about what that means, because I think we're already starting to see in Australia that people are applying the label explicit instruction to all sorts of things that are not really explicit instruction. But I would take my definition, I'd go back to the process product research of the 1960s, 1970s, looking at teachers who produced the largest gains with their students. It's all correlational, so it's not experimental, but there's some pretty strong findings from there. Rosenshine has summarised Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction. It's in American Educator magazine. It's very good summary of that research and its findings, and the sorts of things that you need to do. One of the things that, when I was talking about motivation, and I was talking about success is important in motivation. Well, if you look at Rosenshine's principles, he says that you should try and obtain an 80% success rate for students. Now, that's just come from correlational observation, so this is the more effective teachers tended to do this. But why might that be the case? Well, it might be that it builds this sense of self-efficacy. So I can do this, which is linked to motivation, and so that could be one of the ways that works. So I think there's a lot in that, and I would pursue that rather than having these revolutions about project-based learning or maker spaces or all these other things that are really quite popular.
Just touching on that point, I think it's in a similar realm when people are on the creative bus that we must have creative spaces, and this is creative, and you've just got to let kids go to be creative. Your thoughts on that, and some of the cognitive research that's come out in talking about how creativity, building that foundational knowledge base, relates to.
Well, I'm not aware of specific research on that. However, I do think that people fetishise creativity as if all creativity is the same. Now, you can doodle something on a piece of paper, and that's creative, but it's not necessarily got a huge amount of value. What is the creativity that's valued in society? That always is built upon a broad set of knowledge and skills. So, a creative response to a software engineering problem requires someone who knows a lot about computer programming, software and things like that. So I don't think we can, it's this idea, this reification of these generic skills. So the idea that creativity is a skill. Well, it isn't. Like, you can be creative in this area, you can be completely not creative in that area. It depends on domain knowledge. The idea that critical thinking is a skill, well, in one of the articles that Dan Willingham's written for American Educator, he says, sometimes children can think critically about things, infants can, And yet scientists, when they're looking at a domain that's not their area of expertise, can't think critically. So it's really related to domain knowledge. So in order to be able to think critically or be creative, you need a lot of domain knowledge in that area in order to do that. These are not things that we can teach as discrete skills through project-based learning or whatever it is that comes along that people claim that can do that.
Because they're not a skill, they're an emergent property.
Yes, they're an emergent property. That's a very good way of putting it. Yes?
Well, you've talked about project-based learning today, but equally the same arguments would apply to things like play-based learning, problem-based learning, where there's an expectation that through immersion, children will pick up skills. Which
Yes.
and play-based learning.
No, they might pick up biologically primary skills.
Yeah.
So they might pick up relationship skills by playing with each other. And so I'm not going to say we shouldn't let children play. I mean, that wouldn't be a very sustainable position, I don't think. But the idea that you can pick up biologically secondary cognitive skills through immersion, I don't think there's much evidence to support that. Problem-based learning is the same, whole language, very similar, but they all start from this naturalistic sort of whole size. Rather than building it up from individual elements, we're going to start with the big picture and work from there, because that's the really interesting thing, that's the really fun thing. But often that's not the best way to structure instruction. Okay, so I think we're done.